Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Duncan Castles and I'm joined this week by the co-founder of Football Transfers, a key figure in Sky Sports' estimated transfer value tool, which we regularly refer to on this podcast, and an astute analyst of the game's player trading market. Welcome back to the Transfers podcast, Paul Macdonald.
Thanks, Duncan. How are you?
Very good, thanks. As I was just saying to Ronan Murphy, our regular host, it's always good to have the money on the show when we're talking about money in football.
Yes, I am the money.
The man who provides the funding for this podcast that you all enjoy. So the January window closed this week. Paul and I are going to take a detailed look at what happened and discuss what it tells us about where our football clubs are today and how we expect them to recruit and dispose of players going forward. But let's start with a news line on a footballer who is being lined up for a move in this summer's window, and I think there's a very high likelihood he will move. That's Geovany Quenda, Sporting's left-footed right wing-back, not even 18 years of age yet, will turn 18 officially in April, born in Guinea-Bissau, brought up in Portugal and broke into Sporting's first team just this season, brought into the team by Ruben Amorim. So far has scored 1 goal and 4 assists in 28 Portuguese League and Champions League games this season and has played 3 times for Portugal under-21s. He is very direct wing-back, interestingly, of the type that Amorim has been trying to bring to Manchester United and has brought one in Patrick Dorgu in the January window. Very good passer of the ball, good dribbler, fast going forward. He's contracted at Sporting until 2027 and has a release clause of 100 million euros in that deal he currently has with the Portuguese league leaders. He is being actively marketed at the moment with the permission of Sporting to leading European clubs. So you will see him being offered to Liverpool, Manchester United, Chelsea, Arsenal. The usual assortment in France will be Paris Saint-Germain, Real Madrid, Barcelona. He's already put himself in that category where the next move for the player is to one of the elite Champions League clubs, or in Manchester United's case, the Champions League aspirant. The information I have on the Transfers podcast is that the current asking price for Quenda will be 60 million euros. That's what's being proposed to those teams. I can tell you there is significant interest from Amorim in bringing Quenda to Manchester United. He sees him very much as the equivalent of Dorgu, who can play on the right side. As we've told you in previous podcasts, Sergio Crucinas came on and gave a long explanation of how Amorim likes to have wing-backs playing essentially as inverted wing-backs, i.e. you have the left-footed player on the right and the right-footed player on the left. He set that up with Dorgu. If he can get Quenda in, that would give him the ability to play both sides of his 3-4-3 system with players who are coming, for most teams, off the wrong foot. But in his idea, you have a player on the wing who can not only go directly up the flank, but when he's passing, will pass into the opportunities and the attacking spaces that have been created by the two sort of number 10s that he plays off a centre forward. So we will wait and see whether United are able to find the finance to do that deal, agree a payments package that fits Sporting, and whether they can convince the player that that's the best option for him to go to. Paul, you put together or helped put together these estimated transfer value analytics that we use in the podcast, but more importantly used on Sky Sports website and are used by clubs to assess whether they should go for a particular player and what price they should be bidding for a player. How does a 60 million asking price look for someone like Quenda?
It is a little bit above the value that we've got him at, which is 39.2 million euros. But it must be stressed that because he's not playing in a top 5 league right now, that number is still exceedingly high for a 17-year-old. It suggests that there is real potential here. And if he was already competing at a really high level, or higher than he currently is, that figure would probably not be a million miles away from the 60 million that's been quoted. So to reference that a little bit more detail, the new version, or ETV 2.0, as we're calling it, really references younger talent more. We'll get to this in a little bit more detail when we talk about Premier League transfers, but certainly the age of transfers is definitely going down. Clubs are kind of recruiting at teenage level now more than ever before, and we wanted to make sure that our algorithm reflected that. So one of the main changes that we made was to make sure that young talent that's identified using Sky Sports' skill and potential algorithms is reflected in the fact that big clubs want to buy younger now and give themselves a runway with young talent more than ever before. So Quenda's positioning here is really quite high considering the level that he's at and the age that he's at currently.
So essentially what you're doing is using measurements of the player's performance on the field to assess what you think the ultimate level they can reach as a footballer is during their career, and then linking that back to what's been done in recent transfer markets, where the money that the clubs are spending on players has been directed, and seeing that it's predominantly being spent on younger players, and then adjusting your model to value those younger players who, one, have the potential to do really well, and two, are already performing at a high level, as Quenda is in the Champions League, at a higher estimated market value than you would have done before.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think the main key driver of our algorithm is what's came before and trying to work out what's going to happen next. And the fact that we update our algorithm every month to reveal new values and then update it comprehensively every half year allows us to kind of assess market changes quite quickly and quite readily. And I think that's never been more prevalent than what's happened basically in the last 2 years, really. The number of younger talents signing to particularly the Premier League has exploded, and our values have to reflect that because that's what people are looking for. So Sky Sports' algorithm's ability to identify young talent coupled with the way that the market is moving allows us to come up with these values which we think are pretty accurate.
Let's talk about what's happened, because that's one of the aspects of the January window that you picked out when we were discussing this earlier in the week. That even in this one snapshot, this window that we've just gone through, we have less deals in total than we had in last January, which was a very low expenditure window, one of the lowest expenditure windows we've seen in the Premier League. But less deals, but those deals are predominantly focused on younger players. I think you've got some numbers on that for us, Paul.
Yeah, I do. So, as you say, Duncan, last January really isn't reflective of anything because spend was low, the sample size will be low, so we leave that to one side and go back to 2023 when the average age of players signed on permanent deals, of which I think there were 43 of them, was around 23 and a half. Fast forward 2 years and into this window now, including some late deals that went through in the last couple of days, we've got 34 deals, of which the average age is a staggering 19.9. I didn't think we'd hit the teens on this one, but we just did in the last day of the window. That is a huge shift. And it's reflective in terms of the deals that we can see happening. If you look at, even if you go back a couple of years, Bournemouth and Brighton, two of the more progressive teams in the league, regularly signing teenagers, or if not teenagers, then certainly 20, 21. United's business with Dorgu in this window, he's 20. It's just, we're in this market shift now where I'm not quite sure, quite frankly, what's going to happen to kind of guys reaching their 30s or even in their late 20s now, where they would always have had a runway, and these guys are fitter than they've ever been before, but they are almost lost to the current transfer model. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens to these guys who will still be fit and still have lots to offer, but they just perhaps don't offer clubs the sell-on potential that a 19 or a 20-year-old might.
Yeah, January window has often been described to me as an emergency window. So you have the clubs who need to sort out injury problems. Tottenham Hotspur is an example here in this particular window, or a club that's in relegation danger. You have Wolverhampton Wanderers as a good example in this window, in that they did 3 deals for players in their 20s and a couple of them in the higher range of their 20s. Or an opportunistic window where you have, and this is what we're seeing more and more of, you have Premier League clubs who are targeting these younger players, teenagers or players in their early 20s that they've done quite often, because we're talking about Brighton here, Bournemouth, Brentford. They've done a lot of analytical research on them as well as traditional scouting, and they will move for the player in the January window if the January window is an opportune time to do a deal that suits them. So you have Manchester United taking 17-year-old Diego Leon from Cerro Porteño, who won't actually join until the summer because he's not old enough to make that international transfer. Bournemouth taking 2 teenage defenders in Julio Soler and Matai Akimboni. Brighton, as you mentioned, their signings 19, 21, and then a kind of an outlier for Brighton in being at the grand old age of 23, and Aaron Kashin taken from the Championship. But they have Stefano Simas, a striker, and Diego Gomez coming in. And then clubs like Tottenham Hotspur, who were the most active of all the teams in the Premier League in this window, taking 3 18-year-olds from other Premier League academies in this window, in Reece Russell-Denny, who's highly regarded from the Chelsea academy, Dan Batty from Manchester City's academy, and Luca Furnell from Liverpool's academy. So that you're seeing now this focus predominantly on kind of long-term planning, even in the January window, which used to be a kind of emergency, sort out the situation. Can we get a new striker in? Can we solve a short-term problem? But now it's moving towards long-term planning.
For sure. And even if you look at the money that Spurs have spent, obviously they brought in those 3 young talents, but the money that they have spent, Lucas Bergvall, 18, Archie Gray, 18, Kinski, the goalkeeper, is 21. I think Solanke's the real outlier there, and even he's only 26. The squad that Ange's trying to shape there is very, very young, and some might say inexperienced, considering the performances of this season. But the way that he wants to play football, he thinks he needs young legs and also the ability to shape these players into the style of play that he wants. So not only are they shopping around in other academies, but the actual money that they are spending, and there has been a fair bit of that. I think that does go a little bit under the radar with Tottenham, that Ange has spent a fair amount of money since he came there 2 summers ago. The average age and the shape of the team is just so young, and it's almost becoming like a blueprint for the rest of the league.
They had across the entirety of the Premier League season the 4th highest net spend of almost £100 million, with more potentially coming down the line. Tottenham, I think, were particularly interesting in January because those 7 players signed and the way in which they acted. Most of it done right at the end. They kind of did one of their traditional Daniel Levy supermarket sweeps as they tried to solve defensive problems right at the end of the window. So you saw in the last few days that they tried to get Fikayo Tomori to come back to England from Milan. He said no to them. They then, another classic Daniel Levy move, hijacked Wolves' pre-agreed deal for Kevin Dansu, the Austrian international from Lens, took that on and took him with a loan with an obligation to buy for €25 million. Tried to sign Axel Disasi from Chelsea as another centre-back. Disasi rejected them and decided to go to Unai Emery at Aston Villa instead, and then put in what I would describe as a pretty questionable bid for Mark Gehi, described as rising to £70 million. trying to do that on the last day of the window when you know Crystal Palace had rejected a big offer from multiple big offers from Newcastle United last summer, and also we knew that Crystal Palace only had 3 fit central defenders for the rest of the season in a 3 centre-back system, of which Gehi was the most important one. That looks like the kind of deal which you expect to be rejected, and you're doing it almost for publicity purposes. Then the other interesting thing they did was Mathys Tel from Bayern Munich. And this is an interesting move in a number of ways, because Manchester United inquired for the player. Guidance I have from Manchester United is that the loan fee that Bayern Munich were asking was so high that they didn't take that to the point of discussing what an option to buy would be. Tel initially said no to Tottenham if you buy Ange Postecoglou's explanation of what happened. It was because he thought very carefully about the move and was very ambitious and wanted to know exactly it was the right club for him, and he has no doubts that Tel wanted to be there. What I'm hearing from the Bayern end is that they actually wanted to sell the player. They wanted to put an obligation to buy clause in the deal of 60 million euros. But in the end, it became an option to buy because the player insisted that he wanted the decision at the end of the season as to whether Tottenham was the right place for him to be. I think it could, if Tel does well there and is convinced by Tottenham, I think that 60 million fee, the option is 55 rising to 60, could prove to be a very astute one. But they went about it in a strange way, and again, could also reference what happened with Randall Kolo Muani, who they bid for earlier in the window. Discussions with PSG, I'm told, were that they couldn't afford to pay the France striker's wages in full, and they were asking PSG to subsidise the loan. PSG said, no, you want the player, you pay the wages in full. Juventus agreed to do that, and then Tottenham called back once they'd heard that Juventus had the deal and said, okay, we will pay the wages in full, but we're told, no, it's too late, the transaction's already in play. So while I agree with you, the focus on young players at Tottenham, it's not the most elegant and rational and carefully figured approach to the market, particularly in comparison with other Premier League clubs.
Yeah, I think the other thing to reference there, obviously, is their wages to revenue ratio, which is comfortably one of the lowest in the Deloitte money list. I think it's somewhere around 42%, which is well below what the projected squad control cost ratio will be in the future. And it seems like they're happy to spend money on fees, but not necessarily the wages that are required these days to get the absolute top level talent into your club.
We'll talk about those squad control measures, but let's first talk about what the total spend was in this January window and how it compares with previous windows.
So the total spend after some late deals went through is 420 million in the Premier League for permanent and loan fees, which is significantly over 4.5 times up on last January, which might, as the passage of time goes, look like a real outlier in that just nobody was wanting to play ball or do any business for many reasons. But it's still way down on where we were in 2023, which was the record for a January window, which was 815 million, of which 286 million of that was Chelsea alone, which is comfortably the most by one team in the January window. But Man City made it their bet to try and beat that in this window, and they almost got there. City in the end spent in the region of 180 million on their talent. So if you compare both windows, you can see that 23 was a massive spend. This is a significant spend too, but one club dominated the spending in either one of those windows. And in this case, it was Manchester City.
And we should emphasise how profoundly abnormal this window has been for Manchester City. I was doing a calculation yesterday, and I think the last 6 winter windows combined, City have spent £72.7 million on guaranteed fees. We're talking, I think the figures you're giving us, Paul, are for guaranteed transfer fees. They're not including the variable payments that are often agreed in these deals. As you say, only one Premier League club has ever spent more in the January window, which was the first year of the crazy Chelsea spend, and no reigning champion has ever spent so much in a January window. Even then, I think you go through the players and you look and you see that they are relatively young individuals they're signing. Relatively inexperienced individuals they're signing, and lawn centre-back Abdulkadir Kusanov for an initial €40 million, who had that very difficult debut. Palmeiras centre-back Vitor Reis, initial €35 million. The oldest deal they've done is for the 25-year-old Omar Mamouche, initial €70 million. On deadline day, and this is an interesting deal, they convinced Porto to let Nico Gonzalez, central midfielder, leave. Now, Porto did not want to sell the player. Porto are in quite a harsh fight in Portugal for only one guaranteed Champions League place next season. And the guidance I was getting from Portugal through this window is that the top clubs are very unlikely to sell their better players because they're under a lot of pressure to defeat each other in the chase for the Champions League and the Portuguese title. I think Cheeky Bergiristan referenced how difficult it had been to complete. They ended up paying the €60 million in Nico Gonzalez's release clause, and I think to give you a sense of how far away that is from his real quality as a player, your estimated transfer value metric has him at €20.9 million. Nico's signing has been perceived as a replacement for Rodri. I think partly because he's a 1.88 central defender. He started his career operating as a number 6 at Barcelona, but he's actually prospered at Porto playing as an attacking midfielder. 6 goals and 6 assists in 24 Liga, Portugal and Europa League games this season. And what I'm hearing from those who are observing that deal is that City are looking at him as a replacement for Kevin De Bruyne, which again gives us a bit of guidance on where City are building for next summer. Paul, what's your sense of why City have gone so heavily on the spend in a January window? Do you feel that there's a big element here is the Premier League's investigation, the independent tribunal's decision, which is about to come out, on whether they'll be punished for the over 100 controversies of Premier League rules, which is something that could see them certainly suffer a transfer ban, or more radically be relegated from the Premier League because of a points penalty that could be placed upon them. So does it look to you like what they're trying to do here is get their business in early, in the concern that they might not be able to do any business in the summer?
Yeah, it should be said from the outset that City have been very prudent over the last couple of years in terms of being able to extract maximum value for their young talent. So their net spend over the last few years is actually really low. Pep spent a lot of money when he first came in at City, but certainly in the last couple of years, City have been getting well over 100 million in revenue for players that barely even scraped into the first team. So they're very good at trading out, and whilst it always looks as if they're spending big, in reality, this window is the first time they've really went truly big for quite some time. So they had the PSR headroom to go and do this in this window, or indeed any window that they wanted, simply because of that. But you're right, Duncan, it could be one of two things. Firstly, I thought it might have been they were simply emboldened by the fact that they had won this case. And that came from the way that they dealt with the Haaland contract extension. the way that they were so brazen about signing him on such a long deal. My thought maybe was that they had thought they had secured victory and then they were just going to go all out to stick it to the Premier League by spending an inordinate amount of money in this window. I am now thinking more along the lines of what you're thinking, in that a transfer ban could be imminent, because City are not silly. They know that in this window, you're never going to extract value. Teams don't want to give up players that are important to them for obvious reasons. They've got their own goals, their own objectives mid-season to fulfil, and by losing talent, it hampers that and causes them issues in terms of their own European qualification or title bids or whatever it may be. So it's just not the right window to go out. And I think even City would admit that the talent that they've purchased in this window, they've probably overpaid for all of them. And that's not necessarily something City have done in the past. So I do think there is a bit of desperation in that, and it does seem to edge towards the fact that a transfer ban could be imminent. Get the business done, get as many deals done as possible for younger guys, because the other issue is, I think Marmoush quite obviously impacts the first team immediately. Yeah. I'm not convinced that any of the other ones do. And to go and get that business done now, when they aren't going to impact anything in the rest of the season, means that in a normal circumstance, they could have waited to the summer and potentially got a better deal. But to rush it through now suggests that there could be something in the offing, which means they're just getting their ducks in a row and being quite prudent about what business they can do, if any, this summer, or indeed maybe even the summer after that as well.
It looks like an insurance policy. As you say, they have signed all of these players over value. In the view of professionals who look at the transfer market, everyone I've talked to and asked about these players, what I get back from them is would not have paid that price for that player. Of the centre backs in particular, the feeling is they are way off being ready for the first team, if they will ever be ready for the first team. Someone yesterday was saying, I think it will take at least 2 years for Vitor Reyes and Kusanov to develop into starters for Manchester City at centre back. We'll see if he's right or not. Definite question marks over how much they paid for Nico Gonzalez. So yes, priced over what they should be is kind of classic January deals, in the sense historic January deals, and the opposite of what we're talking about with clubs like Bournemouth and Brighton picking off specific targets that they can get from South America at this time, because the South American season is over, so it's a logical time to take the players. On your point about the Premier League punishments, I think it's interesting that all of the money has been spent outside the league. They're not tried to take any players from Premier League clubs. They've not given any money to Premier League clubs, and we know that they are upset with multiple Premier League clubs in the way that they have been acting around this Premier League investigation. They feel that they've been harshly treated, so could be coincidental, but I think there's probably a bit of relevance in that. You mentioned the Haaland deal, and yes, that long-term contract looks like a huge statement, and Manchester City were happy to brief that a 9.5-year deal had removed all the release clauses that had been put into Haaland's original deal when he moved to City, when he'd been between moving to City or Real Madrid, and the people around him wanted the option to move to Real Madrid at a later stage to be written into the deal at a defined price. While they've briefed that, they haven't been happy to discuss whether any new clauses have been inserted into that deal. Again, I could be very wrong in this, but I would be hugely surprised if Haaland had signed a 9.5-year deal, which completely committed him to Manchester City, where they had total control over his exit going forward. So you can have something that looks like a massive statement, but were the worst to happen to them and they were to go down into the Football League, perhaps we will see that 9.5-year contract turn into a lot shorter period of time for Haaland. Paul, let's look at the overall spend for the summer and the winter windows combined, because that always gives you gives us a sense of where the clubs are and what they've been trying to do across the course of the season, and it gives us an indication of what they might try and do ahead of the coming season.
So, as normal, the summer window massively outweighs the winter window. In the Premier League, we were just short of £2 billion last summer, and in this window we were around about 420 million, so that's 2.4 billion total. And as is always the case, teams are reluctant to do business in winter when they can strategise and plan a lot better for the summer window, and this is no exception. The percentages, if you look back over the last 5 or 6 years, or even further back than that, I think there's one or two anomalies. You've got Van Dijk went to Liverpool in the January window. I think Arsenal signed Aubameyang for a big fee. I think City signed Aymeric Laporte, which was actually, ironically, Duncan, the last big deal that they did in the January window in 2018. Those kind of deals are pretty rare mid-season. Teams would rather do those in the summer, and that's reflected in a lot of the fees because everybody's looking to do business. And it's notable that some teams in this window, your Brentfords, your Evertons, Fulham, teams like that, just did no business or did very late loan deals because it's just not of any interest to them to do business in this window when they can strategise and plan for the summer. So that kind of ratio in terms of winter spending to summer spending has been largely upheld this summer, and it's always roughly in and around that 20 to 25% of the overall spend or less comes in a season. It always comes in the winter rather than the summer. So we're kind of in that kind of same ballpark again this year.
And this 2.4 billion total figure for the season, it's 15% down on the record spend of 22-23. We should also pay attention that the 2.4 billion for this season has been inflated by the non-market value deals that clubs like Newcastle United were doing at the end of June in order to sort out their PSR situation. So you've got Newcastle United paying Nottingham Forest 20 million for a reserve goalkeeper who they've subsequently used in one League Cup tie against the mighty AFC Wimbledon, Odysseus Vlachodimos. There were 6 clubs operating in that way at the end of June. So we should, I guess we have to say from that the spend for the 2023-24 season is effectively the lowest of the last 3 years, the total spend.
Yeah. Those deals that you reference, Duncan, were very much all PSR driven. One team signing another in exchange for another player, and some of those guys have been a success. Elliot Anderson at Forest being one, but a fair few of them haven't seen the light of day since those deals have been done. So if you take a lot of those deals into consideration, that's an extra between 175 and 200 million of business that happened in the summer, which was purely for accountancy practices rather than actually impacting first teams. So yeah, there is a little bit of temperance on the spending, and I do think that teams are starting to assess and address the overall value of transfer fees in and around that kind of mid-20s range, where, as I said previously, I think there's 2 reasons for that, Duncan. I think one is tactically. I do think that teams are setting up in a particular way now, which necessitates players that have got great engines that can get up and down the pitch, can counter press, but also get back and defend. I think that teams are edging towards a younger profile simply because they can be fitter and they can get that done more consistently across the rigours of a Premier League and potential European season. So I do think there's tactical elements to it, and Pep Guardiola and Andoni Iraola in the last couple of months have referenced this specifically, how the game is changing and how the profile of player that they're looking for is changing too. So I do think there is a tactical element to it. But as I referenced at the start, I do think a fair chunk of it is to do with sell-on ability to sell on. So like a guy like Larry Yoro, who United picked up in the summer, probably overpaid for him at that time in his career. But if Yoro is a superstar, then he'll be worth way more in the market to sell to Real Madrid or whoever in the future. But even if it doesn't massively work out, there is an ability to claw back some of that transfer fee when the player eventually leaves, and you just don't get that ability to do that with a guy like Harry Maguire or even at this point potentially Rashford, who is way down on where his market value was a couple of years ago. Getting value for those guys at that stage of their career is just really difficult. So clubs are definitely looking at 17, 18-year-olds, knowing that worst case scenario, they don't really work out, but they're still 22 or 23 at the end of the contract and can get some of that and recoup some of that funds back at the end of that deal.
Assuming, of course, they convince someone like Lenny Yoro to sign a new contract at Manchester United. There is always the risk. He comes, spends 5 years there and says, right, I'm moving to Real Madrid. I've demonstrated I'm the player for Real Madrid now and I'm going on a free transfer. Yeah,
but at that point, I think Man United, with the greatest of respect, would be happy for any player to be playing well at the minute. So if Lenny Yoro gave them 3 or 4 good years and he refused to sign a new deal, I think that would be an acceptable loss for them at that point. But you're right, that's the balancing act. You've got young guys that you're bringing in that you know are going to take a couple of years to develop, but halfway through that contract, if they're playing well, is really when you want them to re-sign. Because if it goes any longer than that, then if they start to play well after that point, then the free agency element really, really plays a part. So it's a hugely difficult balancing act to make sure that you're blooding the guys, giving them game time, allowing them to develop, but also referencing the fact that you don't want to leave for free if they become a really top player. So it's difficult, but there is always that element that if you can manage to get rid of the guy, if he's not playing well at an age of 20, 21, he's still got massive potential for somebody else down the line, and you can get some of that money back. And I think, again, sorry Man United fans to continue to reference your club, but I think a lot of the business that United have done previously, your Casemiros, etc., there is just no long-term value for that player in the club to recoup any money, unless, of course, a Saudi Arabian bid or something comes. But in reality, even the Saudis aren't interested in players at that level of spend at that top end of the market now. They're looking to go younger, as we saw with John Duran. So it's a very difficult market for those players, but also very difficult to try and move those players on for a club if they're surplus to requirements.
Yeah, the Saudis want younger players or very specific talents, absolute elite talents with the right profile, such as Mohamed Salah. You can be sure that Marcus Rashford was offered to Saudi Arabia. Casemiro was definitely offered to Saudi Arabia again. No takers. Because you mentioned Rashford, let's talk about what happened there, because in the end, with Manchester United giving him the freedom to go and talk to whichever club he wanted, drawing interest from Borussia Dortmund, AC Milan, who in the end decided to take Kyle Walker for the one English slot they had available for them. Rashford's preference being to move to Barcelona, which always looked a difficult deal to do because we know what Barcelona's financial circumstances are. And in the last week, he moves to Aston Villa. I think the deal is interesting there. There's no loan fee being paid by Villa. United managed to get a high percentage of the wages paid. The brief is 75% of Rashford's wages and up to 90% depending on performance in the team. He did not want to sacrifice any salary to move elsewhere. That was one of the things that I'm told United proposed to him, given that he had publicly stated that he wanted a new challenge. Their response to that was, if you say you want a new challenge, then you contribute something by taking a pay cut. He didn't do that. They've included in the deal to Aston Villa an option to buy at £40 million. So they've effectively set a summer value for the player at 40 million if Villa want to take him. Now that's radically down on what they could have got for Rashford 2 seasons ago when Paris Saint-Germain were looking at signing him. I would argue it's also radically down on what they could have achieved in the summer if they had taken the look at their squad that they now say they're taking. Like they're talking this game of, we've got to really change the way we operate. We've got to get rid of high earners. We've got to look at young players with resale value. We've got to even consider doing PSR deals if we get offered really high fees for stars of the academy, like Alessandro Garnacho and Kobe Mainoo. They're talking about this very different approach to transfer activity going forward. But did they not miss the opportunity to do all of this in the summer when they had the change of management control, when they had the ability to change coach without doing it mid-season, without trying to rebuild the squad from a tactical perspective mid-season, rather than doing it on the hoof and boxing themselves in a January window, to the extent where a team that's in the bottom half of the Premier League table, struggling to score goals, has allowed 2 forwards in Rashford and Antony to leave, and added none.
When you lay it out like that, Duncan, I think that the Ten Hag situation, I just think, is staggering and atypical of where the club is at the minute. I don't know, maybe you know more information that Amorim potentially wasn't available at that point, but I think he probably was. The way that they flip-flopped on Ten Hag, I almost, not quite, but almost felt sorry for him in terms of how that relationship developed, because everyone outside of the club anyway knew that was a lame duck situation that had to be changed. So by operating that way, giving Ten Hag that 3 or 4 months at the start of the season, and crucially, a full summer to spend a lot of money that Amorim is going to have to try and rebuild, I just think they've cost themselves, if not a full season, maybe even longer than that, because Amorim, because of PSR reasons, etc., probably won't have the firepower going into this transfer window that he would have had the spend been tempered a little bit last summer and a bit more holistic in the review of the squad then than it's going to be now. And you couple that with an absolutely disastrous season, almost certainly no European football, certainly not Champions League unless they pull something out the bag in the Europa League, it becomes a hard sell for Amorim not only to get the talent in that he wants, but to get guys who actually want to come to the club. Because it's not exactly the place where players have been making their name for themselves over the last few years. If you look at even the optics of the Rashford deal, and I know there's 2 sides to every story when it comes to this, the optics of it, his relationship with the club and how that has deteriorated, just doesn't look good for the club in general. And when you look at other talents that have went there, your likes of Højlund, Zirkzee, these kind of guys who potentially looked at United as being a platform for them to become real star players, it's not been good for any of them. And it all can be traced back to kind of the mismanagement of Ten Hag in the summer. Had they changed the managerial position in the summer to someone else like Amorim, had they spent less money and had been more strategic in the signings that they did make, they would be a lot further down the path than they are right now. But this, at the minute, is just beginning to look like a complete lost summer. And like I say, it could be even longer than that if Amorim can't get in the players that he wants to play his 3-4-3 system. Yeah,
look, on some of your points there, Amorim appointed, or the appointment driven by Omar Barada, the new chief executive. So he wasn't at the forefront of their thinking in the summer. You make a very good point about convincing players to come in. We talked about Geovany Quenda at the start of the podcast. Yes, they have the advantage of him owing his start in first team senior professional football to Amorim and the established relationship there. So that will help them. But they have to go head to head, or Quenda is being offered to clubs in superior positions in terms of the quality of football that can be presented to him. Victor Gyökeres, the Sporting striker who scored the most goals over the last calendar year, has been talked about as being the first choice for Amorim at centre forward. We mentioned on this podcast on multiple occasions that the guidance that coming from Gyökeres' camp is he's not convinced that Manchester United is the right place for him to come in his career. So at best, they're going to have to do a very good persuasion job if they can get together the money to satisfy Sporting, and a player like Gyökeres and the number we're hearing as a kind of gentleman's agreement on the transfer fee is 80 million euros that between Sporting and Gyökeres. So yeah, look, I think that the key thing here is United knew, and people in football knew they were in a tight position going into the summer, and they needed to get things right. I think we talked on the podcast about how important last summer's business was going to be to them. And they clearly didn't get it right, which just complicates matters going forward. And as you say, sets them back perhaps a year, perhaps longer than that. Profit and sustainability. How big an impact would you say that's had, not just on Manchester United, but on the whole Premier League transfer business across the season? I mean, I'm looking at the highest gross and net spends on transfer fees for the season, and we have Brighton as the highest spending club. Imagine predicting that 2 or 3 years ago, that Brighton would be the highest spenders, not just in Premier League, but in global football, with 237 million gross and 193 million net. Second highest across the season was Ipswich Town, taking a strategy of spending aggressively to try and stay up in the division. And then the highest gross and net receipts for transfer fees this season, Aston Villa, Champions League club, who've taken over €250 million euros on sales, with a net income of around €70 million, with possibly more to come if Leverkusen activate the option, the 20 million option they've taken on Emilia Buendia. PSR's had a lot to do with that pattern of spend, hasn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I think Aston Villa can thank Saudi Arabia for a fair chunk of that receipts for Duran and Diaby in particular, helping to accumulate that amount. But I think, yes,
77 million guaranteed for Duran, 60 million straight for Diaby.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yes, so as of the 2023-24 season, all clubs have passed PSR, so there's not going to be any penalties for their activities last year. The Premier League were satisfied with the accounts that were filed, but it's still very much at the forefront of teams' thoughts in this window that perhaps would have done more business had it not been a factor. If you look at Man United in particular, they got the deal done for Dorgu, but they must be perilously close to PSR regulation breaches now, given the spend, because United traditionally are not very good at recouping money for transfer fees. I think a lot of United fans are bemoaning the fact that Scott McTominay is playing so well for Napoli. But it's clear that McTominay was a sale that absolutely had to be made for PSR purposes. He was a homegrown talent, which meant that 100% of the transfer fee received for him could be banked in the accounts. Had that not happened, their situation at the moment would look way more dire than it currently is. And I don't think Ten Hag actually probably wanted to sell McTominay. I think it was a necessity.
No, he didn't. He didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you look at the conversations that you mentioned there about Menu and Garnacho, Duncan, the reason why those guys have been mentioned is for exactly the same reason. They can bank that 100% of any fee that they get for those players in the accounts, and it helps the PSR situation greatly. So United are clearly thinking along those lines that they might be in trouble if they don't get something done here. So that's definitely impacted their business. If you look at Newcastle, I think that Newcastle, under previous circumstances, would have went and spent to try and give themselves an advantage in the race for Champions League, but instead chose to be very prudent and made 2 sales, Lloyd Kelly and Miguel Almiron, instead, to give themselves a better PSR position for the summer. Villa, as you mentioned, are very, perhaps not in danger anymore, but were very wary of the PSR situation prior to the Duran deal being done. So that clearly played a massive role in their spending. Teams like Everton, for example, the Everton situation has been dire for some time. They couldn't really go and do business because of this. So teams have definitely been on the wary side of giving themselves penalties when we're in the last year of PSR anyway. It's just not something that you would want to do. It's just not how you would run a club prudently. And I think because of that, because we're moving to different regulations from the 25 season, I think that teams just want to give themselves the best possible situation financially to go into those new regulations with a clean slate with the Premier League.
Yeah, Manchester United have said on record in a letter to supporters that they had to take steps to avoid getting into trouble with PSR and UEFA financial fair play rules. So they've said publicly that they're tight. Villa, I think you can see from the club's actions and that they proposed last summer that the net loss or allowable loss over 3 years be increased by £30 million in order to give themselves some headroom by changing the regulations. That was rejected by the rest of the Premier League. A little detail in their negotiations last week, in that they took Marco Asensio from Paris Saint-Germain on loan instead of Jean Felix. They've been offered the two players. Unai Emery keen on both of them. Felix going to Milan. Chelsea insisting that Milan pay €5.5 million as a loan fee, which was basically the amortization value of the 5 months he'll spend at Milan. PSG allowing Asensio to go to Villa without a loan fee. Wages had to be paid in full. My guidance is that Villa asked for an option to buy to be included in that deal, but refused to take one when PSG insisted that if you want an option to buy, you have to pay a loan fee in order to get it. So again, that suggests that Aston Villa, despite that big take on John Duran, are still tight on their financial headroom. And we can also look at the 6 clubs who got involved in those PSR swap deals in the summer. The ones you mentioned, Elliot Anderson, Omari Kellerman, etc. So we have Aston Villa, Chelsea, Everton, Leicester, Newcastle and Nottingham Forest. Multiple deals in there over market value where clubs were trading to each other in order to use an accounting trick to get themselves through PSR without points penalties. If you look at what they did in January, 3 of those clubs did not pay a transfer fee to add a senior player to their squad, and all the others spent less on transfer fees than they took in. So you see that although they've solved for the past season, this season is problematic for them. You mentioned the change to the PSR system that's coming in this summer. That, Paul, is going to be a shift to something similar to the way UEFA are operating financial fair play going forward, in that clubs are going to be limited to a squad cost rule. And the squad cost rule is the sum of players, coaches and salaries plus whatever net profit or loss they make on player trading and agents' fees. And they are going to be limited to 85% of their total revenue in the Premier League. So you can spend up to 85% of your revenue on wages and recruitment costs for players and coaches. Now that changes, interestingly, if you are qualified for European competition, in that if you're a Premier League club that's in European competition, you're only allowed to spend 70% of your revenue on coaches' salaries, player salaries and player trading. They're also experimenting with what they call a top-to-bottom anchoring rule. And the idea being that no club will be allowed to spend more than 5 times the lowest forecast central distribution, i.e. the television and prize money coming from the Premier League, that will be paid to the 20th place club. And that rule is under legal challenge from the PFA, so we don't know whether it will hold coming into the new season. We'll need another Premier League AGM and vote on these squad cost control rules to see if anchoring is included as well as a percentage of total revenue. The 70% of total revenue has been designed to bring it into line with the European regulations that have been gradually coming into force over the last 3 seasons, and next season will limit all clubs in European competition to 70% of their spend. It's quite a difference, quite a change from the way the rules are set up at present, Paul. Do you envisage some complications in the transition to a UEFA-style limit on spending dependent on revenue?
Yes, because there always will be. There's always loopholes, there's always ways around them, and clubs have been desperate to kind of find ways to kind of usurp the system with PSR, and I don't think there'll be any difference when it moves to this system. I think one of the main ones that I can identify, and one that we discussed briefly last week, Duncan, is the teams that are potentially competing in the lower levels of European football, so like the Conference League. The way that the European systems for qualification now are set up, conceivably a team finishing 9th, 10th, 11th in the Premier League could find themselves playing in Europe with a reduced level of percentage spend of their overall revenue, but also having to compete at a European level, which would require a bigger squad, more players, and more matches across a week. That could be something that I could see being an issue from the beginning that they have to address, because if you are, say, I don't know, the way that Everton are playing right now, Everton can continue to climb the table, they finish 11th, and they need to spend money to compete in Europe. There is nowhere near as much prize money available in the Conference League as there is in the Champions League. So that level of ratio spend doesn't quite sit right with me. It doesn't feel fair. And you really don't want teams feeling punished by entering European competition. That's not anything that UEFA certainly wants. So I wouldn't be surprised if they looked at that and maybe amended that in some way for the two lesser European competitions, just to make it a little bit easier for clubs to have the squads that they need to compete in those events.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a choke point there, is what happens if you have to shift from 85% of revenue to 70% of revenue with only a small additional gain from being in one of the minor European competitions. I think European competition in general is going to be a big factor in the transfer market going forward. I think this season has demonstrated that the expanded European competitions have been really hard on clubs who are in them. We're seeing so many muscular injuries occurring in the majority of the English clubs who are playing in European competition, and I think there's going to be some squad building changes factored into purchases in the summer. I'll use Manchester City as an example. Probably shouldn't, given what we said earlier about the potential of them not even being in European competition, but we do have Pep Guardiola talking on record about how he feels that the idea of running a tight squad has kind of been undermined by this necessity of playing at least 2 extra games in the group stages. And if, like Man City, you only just scrape through, having only beaten the might of Slovan Bratislava and Brugge to get into the knockout round for the Champions League, you have another 2 extra games in there, and those games shoved into the busy January-February period as well. I'll throw a curveball at you, Paul. Where do you see the summer window going in terms of number of deals, volume of deals? We have less deals in this January window than 2 January windows ago, but a higher average price, higher average transfer fee on those deals. And at the top end of the market, do you see any records being broken? Because it's been noticeable, the decline in the level of spend at the top end in this last 2 major windows. So I think you have Omar Marmoush just beating the deal that Tottenham did for Dominic Solanke to be the highest spend of the Premier League window, and the highest transfer fee of all, 77 million euros guaranteed, rising to 90 million, is done by a Saudi club, but still, well under those 100 million plus figures that we'd got accustomed to a few years ago.
I did a piece a couple of years ago, actually, maybe last year now, that my belief was that Neymar will always be the record transfer, that it would never be beaten. Now, the only thing that's shaken my opinion on that is the potential of Saudi Arabia to go and do something really, really crazy. But I just don't think there's a player in the market right now. Maybe Haaland, I guess, but I'm just not convinced that there's another player of that profile which would merit such a huge transfer fee. I think that one of the underlooked parts of any transfer window is the cash injection that comes in, which creates a domino effect among the other teams. And we definitely saw a little bit of that in this window with the Mermouche deal to Frankfurt. Set off a bit of a chain of events where they go and sign Wahi from Marseille go and sign Guiri, and then the money stays in the system and flows down, but there has to be an injection of it at the very top. And I think this summer window will be very much reflected by the ambition of the Saudi teams. I think if they go and make 3 or 4 really, really big signings and inject a lot of money into the market, you could see a domino effect there where teams have got money that they didn't have previously and are able to go and stretch their legs a little bit and go and spend. But I think the window, once again, it really lives or dies by how much money is injected from the Middle East. And that could be City again if they are able to, or it could also be PSG, who we didn't even touch on the fact really that they spent €70 million on Kvaratskhelia in this window. That's that money that's injected into the market that's not already there plays a huge factor into what deals can be done. And if that Saudi money doesn't come, and I think it will, because I think they're ambitious and they have they want to grow out that league, and they've been keeping their powder dry a little bit in this window, despite the Duran deal. And I think once that money comes, then you'll see other teams start to spend amongst each other, and we might see a big window. But if for some reason that money doesn't come, I think you're into a really interesting window in terms of how transfer fees and market value operates going forward, because with the new regulations coming in, teams are just more wary of ever than going spending a huge amount on a player when there could be financial considerations and potential penalties if it doesn't work out. So yeah, I think the Saudis are going to have an even bigger role to play in this market maybe than ever before.
Yeah, just to underline that, the 4 biggest fees of the winter window, 2 of them from Abu Dhabi owned Manchester City, Omar Marmoush and Nico Gonzalez, 1 from Qatar owned Paris Saint-Germain, Kwisha Kvaratskhelia, 1 from Saudi Arabia for John Duran. And Saudi spend could have been more because they had that 70 million in the end for Kaoru Mitoma from Brighton, which Brighton knocked back at the end of the window. So had that gone through, just that one deal, that would have made them the second highest spending league after the Premier League. The main limitation is that they have filled all the clubs have filled all their 8 overage foreign player slots at present. So I think that Saudi decide to spend aggressively in this window, and they are preparing for it. They're talking about Mohamed Salah publicly, talking about the interest of them publicly, talking about their interest in Vinicius Junior, which is something we've talked about in the podcast back in the summer and is an ongoing kind of standing invitation from Saudi Arabia. If you want to come and be the face of the Saudi League, we will pay you one of the highest salaries in world football to do that, and we will sort Real Madrid out with a high transfer fee to achieve it. The limitation is mainly restructuring their own league and moving players that they put on incredibly high wages to come there out of the league and finding homes for them. That might be the hardest part for them, rather than whether they have the finance to inject into the market. And I think you're absolutely right. It's where that external cash comes from. If that external cash arrives, determines what the majority of clubs in the European window are able to do, because most of them at present are running too close to or on the limitations of what financial fair play and PSR rules allow them. There are just a few exceptions, such as Manchester City and Tottenham Hotspur, who you highlighted earlier in the podcast. Let's wrap up with the hero and villain section, Paul. I'll let you do the hero this week because you've been doing lots of critical commentary. It'd be nice to be generous to someone at the end of the podcast.
I think it's time that we had a bit of respect for David Moyes, quite frankly. He's not involved in the transfer market, and he doesn't have to be, because he's inherited a squad from Sean Dyche, and he's working magic there. And if we're talking about clubs that are running close to the limit of financial excesses, then the disaster that has been Everton over the last 3 or 4 years is really one of them. And had they went down this season, with the new stadium arriving, it would have been an absolute disaster for them. But instead, they've brought in a man who is consistently underrated by other fans and peers. I think West Ham fans consistently underrated what he delivered there. European trophy, finishing 6th or 7th in the league on the regular. Yes, the football at times wasn't as progressive as people like, but you can't have everything. And I think what he's done in 3 weeks at Everton suggests that maybe Everton should have done it a long time before that, because they wouldn't be in the situation they're in. So a bit of praise for Mr. Moyes. He's still got the chops to manage at that level, get teams to play for him, and get the best out of some attacking talent that was already there. Ndiaye at Everton is one of my favourite players in the league, and he only showed glimpses of his talent under Dyche, and I think now he's really looking like a top player. So big up to Mr. Moyes. Well done, mate. And I'll put some respect on your name.
I think that's a great choice, and underlines that there is still space for experience and rational management, and coaches who are prepared to do things different from the fashionable, let's play everything from the back and high press the opponents, and it doesn't matter. Let's ignore the fact that our goalkeepers or defenders aren't capable of doing that on a regular basis, but we have to do it because that's the fashion of the day. So, villain of the week, I was very tempted to go for Todd Boehly, the director and co-owner of an unauthorised ticket website, according to the Premier League, which currently lists some Chelsea tickets for his own club at over £6,000 on the shadow market. But I decided that it will be FIFA and Adidas this week for introducing an official ball for the summer's Club World Cup tournament in the United States, which is essentially an American flag in the shape of a football. You get the impression that they only just managed to avoid going for an all-red ball with a Make America Great Again logo because they thought that would make the most money from the fans stateside.
Well, I'm glad you chose not to pick Todd Boehly, because we'd have to change it to probably the Hero and Boehly Award, because I think he's been given it so many times by now as the villain that we'd need to rename it. So I'm glad we went with someone else.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast, Paul. Great to have your analysis and great to have your thoughts on where the market is and where it's going to go next.
Anytime, Duncan. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Transfers podcast, powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you like what you heard, spread the message. Please follow, share and rate us. You can message us on Instagram, YouTube and Facebook at Transfers Podcast. Our Twitter and Blue Sky address is at TransfersCast. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky at Duncan Castles. Paul is at Paul McDFC. Our production is by Mark Caulfield at Pro Podcast Production, and our music by Mark Caulfield and David L. Stay safe, be well, and thank you for listening.
He did the transfer window. Ian McGarry, who left us and wasn't known for a couple of years. Duncan was low. Now he's back with a new show. It's called The Transfers. It's where everyone's gonna go. The transfers, the transfers, the transfers. Where everyone's gonna go. Where everyone's gonna go. The transfers, the transfers, the transfers. Where everyone's gonna go. 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 Where everyone's gonna go.